Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar focused on keeping the water on during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Savannah Betkowski, and I work at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box at any time throughout the session. We will also be using the hand raised feature. You can see in that the bottom line in the blue box, that's the icon right there that you'll be having to utilize today. We will also be posting the presentation as well as a video recording on our website, and you can reach that website at the link in the bottom left-hand corner. You will be receiving a follow-up email that includes a link to all of these materials. We do not submit our webinars to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits. We do provide certificates of attendance as a courtesy. It can take 1 to 2 weeks to send out the certificates of attendance, and you must attend this entire webinar to receive one. You must have joined this webinar using the unique join link that was emailed to you when you registered in order for us to count your attendance. We do apologize that we cannot guarantee if this webinar will meet requirements for specific CEU or license renewal needs, but if you have any questions about this, you can email us at smallsystems@syr.edu. And for a little bit about the Environmental Finance Center Network, our program provides training and technical assistance to small water public systems across all U.S. states and territories to help local water systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And here you can see the various centers that make up the Environmental Finance Center Network. You can see that we have both centers and partner organizations spread across the entire country for this year's programming. We work together to create solutions for difficult how-to-pay issues of environmental protection and improvement. And so to jump right in, I would like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. With us today, we have Stacy Isaac Barazer, CEO of IB Environmental. So Stacy, welcome, and I pass everything over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Savannah. Just want to check that you are hearing me and seeing my screen okay?
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I wanted to just take a second just to acknowledge that although we're all obviously well enough to be participating in this webinar today, we're able to focus on our work activities right now, but there are so many grave needs and just unfathomable suffering, which are somehow incredibly affecting the entire world all at once. And so it seems appropriate to acknowledge verbally that this is just a crazy time for the world. Fortunately, though, for us, our professions give us a way to help chip away at this global pandemic. So we're going to get into some of the materials here to help address in our small way what's going on with this pandemic. So I'm very happy you joined us. Before we get going here further, just a little bit of an overview so you kind of see IB Environmental's background or perspective on this. So we are a small firm. We focus, most of our work actually is on water affordability and even some energy affordability and equity. So we work with local utilities to develop customer assistance programs for low-income customers. We help design some of those programs at different utilities. And we make sure that the customer assistance programs are well funded as well as accessible to customers. And we work on policies related to affordability at both sort of the national and the state level. Besides that, we actually work on a few other areas in a more limited capacity. So we work on different funding sources, stormwater and watershed management. And if you're wondering about the accent, we do some work in the Caribbean, particularly in Puerto Rico, as well as Trinidad and Tobago, which is where I am from originally. So in terms of an outline of what we will be sort of focusing on today, it's a big topic, right? We cannot give you all the answers to make your utility totally financially viable in the face of this pandemic, but we want to offer a few main areas to go over. So we'll talk about shutoffs and just generally how you address the non-payment issues, right? So we'll talk about shutoffs, we'll talk about these customer assistance programs, or CAPS for short, and we'll talk about a concept having to do with restricting the flow to some of your customers. Then we'll offer a few other practical tips, but I'm hoping that you guys will participate in this as well. We don't have all the ideas here. We don't have all the solutions. So if you will use the Q&A box that Savannah showed you early on in the webinar, you can go ahead and send your ideas. So if there's something that your utility has done and found particularly useful in terms of addressing sort of finances in light of the pandemic, that would be great. We will, not everyone will not be able to see your ideas and suggestions live, but we'll share some of them out loud on the webinar, and then we'll also compile a list to share with all the attendees after the webinar. So again, use the question and answer box to suggest things that have worked from your experience with your utility or that you've heard about, and we'll share those. Okay, so we're gonna start with a poll here, and Savannah's gonna bring that up. It's a tough question, but basically about what percentage of increase in non-payment are you seeing during the COVID-19 pandemic? So we'll say since March of 2020, what increase are you seeing in non-payment, say, compared to prior years?
Thanks, Stacy. And we'll leave this poll open for just a few more moments here. And we'll get ready to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. And so, Stacy, it looks like 48% of attendees have no idea. 18% are between the range of 5 and 10%. 15% of attendees have answered between 0 and 5%. And then we have an equal distribution of 9% of attendees answering between 10 and 20 or more than 20.
Okay, great. Thanks for summarizing the results, Savannah. And yes, going forward, we'll have a couple other polls, and the have no idea or I don't know is going to be very attractive, just because it's hard to have the data at our fingertips that we need to make even some decisions going forward. Yeah, so that 5 to 10%, I think, or even around 15% is reflective of some of the other sort of more national surveys that we've seen. So, and again, to reiterate, the question was asking the increase sort of over the background, like what you normally see, right? So non-payment obviously is an issue, and it's logical with the number of people who have lost jobs, etc. We expect that our customers would have more problems paying their bills now than they've had traditionally in the past. So one of the sticks, if you will, that water utilities have been able to use in the past to get their customers to pay would be the shutoff of water services. So we're going to talk a little bit about that right now. There is, of course, a lot of suspensions on water shutoffs nationally. So let me start by saying that the federal government has not put a moratorium on shutoffs. However, from one source that we've looked at, and you can see it at the bottom of your screen here, as of the middle of this month, there were at least 16 states, including DC and Puerto Rico, that had some sort of statewide moratoria on shutting off. So this little table here shows you where some of the moratoria currently exist, and in a few states the moratoria have expired. A couple of the states under existing moratoria are shown here in italics just because there are little caveats associated. So, for example, in Montana, the moratorium expired, but except for members of what they call vulnerable populations. But Maryland is probably a better example of the italics here, where the state referred to something called companies in their Office of the People's Counsel, though, is saying that companies, while it traditionally refers to privately owned water utilities, they are interpreting it or applying it to both publicly and privately owned. So obviously some caveats there, some different flavors, among the different states. But that's kind of where we are in terms of if the decision has been made for your utility in terms of holding off on shutting people's water off, or if your state has not kind of made that decision for you. We're gonna do an activity here, and that's what Savannah was referring to before about the raise your hand function in the GoToWebinar here. So please raise your hand if your utility is under a statewide moratorium on shutoffs. And hopefully folks remember where that feature was at the top of the screen.
Oh yes, Stacey. We are having quite a few attendees raise their hand right now. I will say we have around 30 folks and more are incoming.
Okay, so we'll give folks another moment there to raise their hand on this one. So, if your utility is under a statewide moratorium right now. All right, Savannah, what are we looking at there?
We have bumped up to around 50 individuals, 60.
Okay. and counting, right? Yeah, so we won't wait for everyone to respond here, but this is just we were looking to see where this particular group of utilities on the phone today or on the webinar fall. So, okay, I believe Savannah is now going to unraise your hand, so don't get alarmed, because we're going to ask the utilities who are, let's see. All right, Savannah. Okay, there we go. If your utility has voluntarily suspended shutoffs, would you mind raising your hand right now, please? And there's only one other option after this, right? So if you are in a state where there was a moratorium, you should not be raising your hand this time. How's it looking, Savannah?
We are rising and counting, but we have around 35 folks right now.
Okay. Just based on the numbers of people we have on the webinar right now, I'm not surprised if the numbers keep going up. But we do have a lot of participants today who are not actually employees of water utilities. So, okay.
Gonna say we have about 40 to 45 folks right now that have raised their hand.
Okay, great. All right, so the next one is probably logically obvious, which is your utility, whoops, not you, there's a typo there, sorry about, your utility is actively shutting off customers right now. So if your utility is actively shutting off customers right now, please raise your hand.
So this one is not happening as much. We have 3 individuals that have raised their hand right now.
Okay, and that is not unexpected. So our expectation, and from what we've been seeing in the news and different, quick surveys from like AWWA or even the Rural Water Association, it's looking like hundreds of utilities across the country, maybe more thousands, right, have suspended shutoffs in light of the pandemic. So, well, great, thanks for your participation there. Savannah, did you want to change that number at all for option C?
We had a total of 6 individuals for that one.
Okay, great. All right, thank you for, thanks for participating. We'll move on to the next slide now. So as you can see, we plan to keep you pretty engaged in this webinar for this hour here. Okay, if you are in a state where there was a declared moratorium, you may be feeling like you have less control, okay? So some of the implications of being in a state with a statewide moratorium versus not, kind of having to give up that control may be difficult. Oftentimes the state is considering the big urban areas more than small or rural areas when they establish these moratoria, for instance. So it could be a little frustrating. But if you are in one of those states, at least all of the utilities in these states have the same guidelines, right? You have the same information and something to follow and respond to. I'll make a little caveat on the word all here, though. So there may be differences within a state with a moratorium, depending on public versus private, for instance, or maybe the size of the utility. But generally, if your state has declared a moratorium, they've given you some guidelines, and you're on the same page with other water utilities. Without a statewide order, maybe you have more flexibility, but maybe that's a curse as well. Maybe you have too many decisions to make on your own, right? Disconnections are an important stick that water utilities rely on. Like we said before, these are extenuating and unprecedented conditions right now. So while utilities want to be flexible, many are saying there needs to be a date when this practice will restart, when they'll have the ability to do shutoffs again. So as I mentioned, I live and work in Georgia, and in a state like Georgia, there has been no moratorium, but no water utility wants to be the first to begin disconnections. Just think about the newspaper headlines in the local newspaper if your utility or your community is the first to begin shutoffs again. So when there is no statewide statement from, let's say, the governor, utilities are left floundering a bit on whether or not to even waive late fees, for instance. So besides shutoffs only, the states that have given some sort of moratorium usually include things or guidance on late fees, for instance. So the utilities have a lot of issues or a lot of questions that they need to answer themselves in states where there was no moratorium. A few recommendations there, some of the discussions that we've been hearing in states without a moratorium, that the utilities in the state can somehow band together on when shutoffs would begin again, so that no one utility is the first, right? So what we're seeing there is a lot of conferences, for instance, have gone virtual. So there are a lot of annual water conferences that happen in the summer that have virtual sessions now. And this could be one topic of very relevant discussion for some of those events. You have a bunch of utilities obviously participating, and maybe discussions on when the utilities will, as a group, sort of in solidarity, begin shutoffs again. Is one suggestion there. But at the individual utility level, it's really important now more than ever to have good communication strategies. So, and I've tried to highlight here the different levels or items on which communication should really be clearly considered at this point. For example, reconnection options for pre-COVID-19 shutoffs here is referring to a customer who had been shut off before the pandemic. Some utilities will reconnect a customer during COVID-19 only if the customer calls and asks for reconnection. And that's all well and good as a policy, but if they did not communicate this to the customers, that has caused some issues within some of the more advocacy type organizations where, okay, we have a policy at the local utility where they will turn your water back on, but you have to call them first. Then you need to really communicate with the customers that they do have that option, and that, but they have to take the step of calling, right? A lot of customers in some of these cases have not been informed that they need to make that call to make it happen. Late fee waiver policies that have to do with the pandemic, some utilities they're not charging late fees in this period, or interest charges, or reconnection fees. And it's important to share that with the customer. And I think written communication, whether on your website or bill stuffers, may be the best way these days to get that information out. To be fair, these policies and practices, if they're written out, the customers can review them to understand their options and the repercussions a little bit better. And you also want to make sure that all the customers have access to the same information, in order to be equitable. When reconnections do occur, you want to make sure that you provide clear instructions to your customers about flushing lines, etc., in terms of health concerns when they are reconnected. And then last but not least, if there are financial assistance programs or even programs that go in and help customers fix leaks in their house, for instance, you want to have communication ready so that you can share with your customers about those types of programs. So a leak fixing program, for instance, would actually help the customer financially in the long run because it would reduce the amount of water that the customer is using, of course. So communication cannot be understated at this point. We can't stress that more. Okay, so we are going to go into another poll question here on this sort of subtopic of identifying the needy. So we want to make sure that when we do give some of our time and resources as a utility to a customer, that this is a customer who truly has a need. So the next poll question is going to be asking you, and Savannah's going to bring this up, is how concerned are you that quote unquote bad actors who can afford to pay their bills are taking advantage of the COVID-19 situation to not pay? So it's best here to not respond, I think, if you are not with an actual water utility. Trying to get a gauge here of how big of a problem of these bad actors the utilities themselves envision.
Thanks, Stacy. And we'll leave this poll open for attendees to answer for just a few more moments here. And we'll get ready to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. So Stacy, 40% of attendees have selected somewhat concerned, 30% have selected very concerned, 14% have answered not too concerned, and we have an even tie at 8% between extremely concerned and fairly confident that's not happening much.
Okay, great. Thanks for that feedback, Savannah. So there seems to be, if we assume that only the water utilities responded there, that there is some level of concern that folks will try to game the system right now. And that's a controversial issue. So I thank you for giving some feedback there. But one of the things that we stress at IB Environmental is maybe not let those bad actors serve as a hindrance to helping the customers who really need the assistance, right? So what's important if you do have bad actors is to try to identify them first and then maybe be less lenient with them. So maybe if someone is just taking advantage of your freeze and shutoffs right now, you don't waive the late fees for that person, for instance, okay? Whereas you may waive it for your other customers who genuinely have need. And I understand that this is not easy to distinguish between those different groups of customers. So we'll move into this area here in terms of identifying those who cannot pay their water and sewer bills. So I'm using here an example from Albany, Georgia. You know, this community not so long ago really stuck out as an outlier in Georgia. If you look at a map of Georgia, there was actually a huge concentration on Albany, Georgia, when it came to COVID cases and even COVID deaths. It was quite incredible. They were second per capita in deaths due to COVID, only to, I think, New York City at one point. Of course, with this pandemic, everything is changing so quickly. So I believe the hotspots are now in different parts of the state of Georgia. Also, it's a fairly small community, so kind of more like the utilities that we have represented on the webinar today in terms of small or medium-sized water utilities. So in terms of Albany, if you were a customer in Albany that was facing problems paying your bills, one of the things you could do is contact these what we call third-party human services and charitable groups. So in the case of Albany, the Salvation Army was assisting, and you know, just doing some digging around. Let's say I wanted to send some assistance, financial assistance to water customers in Albany directly. One of the things that you would do, at least on the United Way's website, you know, you can specify Albany Core, for instance, just for making some calls, trying to figure out how one might help customers in that particular part of Georgia. Those were some suggestions. So to reiterate, the human services organizations, the charitable groups, sometimes even religious groups in your community already have systems in place and programs in place to help low-income customers. So if you're trying to sort of tease out or identify who really need assistance, who can't pay, this is one good place to start. Also, there are some services where you can actually try to take your whole customer base and look at payment patterns, right? So the customer assistance staff, the folks who answer the phone maybe for your water utility, they usually have a good sense of the customers who call very often. So they repeatedly call for help. And so they may be able to give you some clues too on who the most genuinely needy folks are in your community. Of course, COVID is creating a bigger group of needy folks, right? And new people are falling into that category. But the customer service group is a place to also kind of begin. And then there are software packages, etc., and tools, IT tools that help you take your whole customer base and segment the customer base into different groups, and then you send specific targeting messages to those different groups. So, you know, you have, this is one case here we got from a specific company, but you have the historically challenged folks versus folks who just maybe forget to pay their bill, and sort of the unique ways or the specific ways to communicate with those different types of customers. So the issue here is non-payment, right? But sometimes the reasons for non-payment, then it's not always low income or affordability issues. And then we wanted to share this tool. This is from the Environmental Finance Center at UNC. It's a really good tool that does an assessment of water and wastewater residential rates affordability. And if you're trying to identify the folks within your community who can't pay their water and sewer services or can't pay for their water and sewer services, this tool is useful in kind of deciding, okay, we'll help people with this amount of income, for instance, right? So can you define those who can't pay by income levels? And so looking at the whole spectrum of income across your community is useful, and this tool is a great way to do that. So we included the link on there where you can access that tool. And this, just so that you know, this is data from an actual water utility. Okay, if you do find issues, let's go back to this last slide. If you think some of these bars are too high, you know, folks who are making $15,000 to $25,000 in my community should not be spending, you know, more than 3.5% or more than 3%. Let's say you make a decision as a community on their water and wastewater bills, then maybe you look into some sort of an assistance program to help those low-income customers. So we'll move into that section now. So we call this a process design or a process to design a customer assistance program, or CAP for short. The first thing you want to ask yourself is there an affordability problem? And you do an assessment like the one we showed earlier to define for your community and your utility if there seems to be a problem. And so once you've done that at the community level, now you have to decide for yourself at the community level whether the bars are too high and when you want to have intervention, let's say, right? If you think that there doesn't seem to be a problem right now, then, you know, if we say the answer is no, really that means that at least not yet, there's not an affordability problem. But if you feel like there is an issue in terms of affordability, then you want to look at designing a customer assistance program. There are all kinds of different types of customer assistance programs. Of course, these are not mutually exclusive, but we mentioned before plumbing efficiency and actually finding a way to go into customers' houses and help repair leaking fixtures, for instance. We have bill discounts, etc. All of those are different types of assistance programs. But also, you have to think about eligibility criteria. So who gets the assistance? You know, again, back to that bar chart from that tool that we saw before, that can be one way to kind of inform where your eligibility will start. Would you look at the federal poverty level? Would you look at, you know, does the person you're about to help financially with their bills, do they get food stamp assistance or what we call SNAP, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program? Maybe if somebody is on the SNAP program, you automatically enroll them into your assistance program. And then you also want to think about outreach, because like we mentioned before in communication, it's wonderful to have the best customer assistance program in the world, you have it all detailed within your utility. But if you do not reach the lowest income customers in your community, then of course you have an ineffective program, and you've really just kind of wasted your time and resources in putting together or designing a program. And outreach is particularly difficult for low income customers. Sometimes, for instance, you have language barriers. So a lot of times you have folks who live in multifamily buildings, and they're a little bit more difficult to reach. It seems there's a huge overlap between difficult to reach and the lowest income folks in most communities. So that's a big challenge in a lot of cases. And then, definitely how you fund the customer assistance program is something very important before you even get started. Okay, so that is a little bit on designing assistance programs once you've identified that there is a need and you've identified the folks who really need the assistance, right? We're gonna go change directions a little bit here, talking about how you can help customers who are having a hard time paying their bills and therefore not contributing financially to your utility because they're not paying. How you might help them lower their bills through this concept of restricted water flow. You may have heard of this term before. It's not very common, at least in the US right now. If you have heard of it, there are different synonyms that we see around. So, for example, in the city of Phoenix that's using this to some extent, they're called restrictor plates generally. South Africa, they have a couple different terms that they use, aerator inserts or water management devices, WMDs. Flow limiter is another synonym we've seen out there, water flow restrictors, and then throttles or throttle valves is another synonym for this. So maybe you've heard of one of these terms in the past. I'll just start off with giving you an example from Cape Town. So if we look at the water management device there in Cape Town, they were facing, a very extreme crisis of kind of running out of water. And so they had to take some extreme measures. However, they had actually been looking at these devices before that as a way to help address affordability. So to help the lowest income customers sort of manage their water use and therefore their water bills. So basically it's an electronic device that's installed into the water meter. It's programmable, and again, they would give that customer a certain allocation per day of water. And like I said, it was supposed to be an affordability program at first, then it ended up being a water conservation program just because they were in such dire needs to conserve water in that city. It enables the household in Cape Town to monitor their water, the available water allocation. It's tamper-proof and it's able to detect water leaks, which really helps the low-income customers as well. And in the case of Cape Town, it really helped the utility sort of manage and conserve the resource. So that's one example from outside of the country. Phoenix in Arizona in the US has also been sort of piloting this technology or something similar before COVID-19. So in this case, and I should mention here that besides the water management devices that are used in Cape Town, there are actually more high-tech, modern water meters in, I'd say many, or at least several water utilities in the US that can remotely restrict the flow of a customer. So some of them can turn off the customer's water remotely from the office. Others can restrict the flow as well. But those, again, tend to be the higher tech water meters. In the case of Phoenix, they use something a little bit different. It's pretty simple technology. It's this blue circle here. It's a little disc with a hole in the middle, and the hole is pretty small, where they insert that into the water meter, and it restricts the flow of the customer. The idea here is that if you can afford to pay the water bill, if you have the financial means, this is so inconvenient to have your water restricted to such a level where, maybe it takes an hour or two to fill a bucket to have a shower, or maybe it takes 10 to 15 minutes to fill a pot so you can cook. The idea is that it's so inconvenient that if you have the financial means, you go in and you pay your bill, or you send your payment somehow so that you're not inconvenienced. But if you genuinely cannot afford the bill, you don't have the financial means, then you at least have enough of a flow of water in your home for hygiene reasons. You can wash your hands, especially, of course, important in these days that we're in with the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is one. Akron, Ohio, I think, has something similar to this, or they have the meters where they've sort of been looking at maybe restricting flow in a way similar to this. So I feel like it's time for another poll question. So we'll get to that, to pull that up. So the question here is, do you think, and we underline and underscore the word think, that the restrictor plates are feasible for your water utility? So when we say, do you think it's feasible, and we know that you don't know for sure, you haven't gone to council or the board of commissioners or whatever, or the water utility directors to ask about this, just, you know, your gut reaction. Do you think it's feasible? Maybe there's something in your state that you happen to know of a law where this is not going to be possible in your state.
Thanks, Stacy. And we'll leave this poll question open for folks here for just a few more moments. I'm getting ready to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. So it looks like at 48%, the majority of attendees answered not sure. 30% of attendees have answered no, and 22% have indicated yes.
Okay, interesting. All right. So again, not sure is a popular choice of response here, even though I was saying, you know, go ahead, we won't hold you to it, you know, give it your best gut reaction. It's the safe way to play it. But if we take the not sures out of the equation here, there are slightly more folks, at least on this webinar, who feel like, no, this would not work, than those who feel like, yes, it would work. So that's interesting, and maybe we'll get some more comments and questions about that, Savannah. But in the meantime, I'll move on. And before I do this, though, it's probably a good idea, Savannah, is there anything that's come up that you want me to address before I move on to the next section of practical tips? Any sort of questions that are burning things?
Yeah, so we have received quite a few questions about the restrictor concept, and so I guess I'll just rattle those off to you right now.
Okay.
So Andy did ask, does the restrictor plate conflict with swamp cooler water needs or flow needs?
I'm not too sure what the term swamp cooler needs means. What was the second part of the question?
So I think those cooler water needs would also be flow needs. That was indicated.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like I said, there are a couple utilities like Akron and Phoenix that I'm more familiar with, the Phoenix situation, where they have been using them. And I don't know that it's caused any problems. They've been doing this in Phoenix at least for a few months. So I don't think it caused any needs with low flow, but be happy to check into that and get back to you if we do find that there are issues.
Great. So do you want me to ask another question? Because we are getting quite a few questions about this.
Okay, sure.
So does restricting water flow make the meters not register or record water use because of the very low flow rate?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Our understanding, at least from the Phoenix case, is that I think it does register. And so, you know, just to explain a little bit further, the benefit of this to the low-income customer is that there would have been, on the volumetric side of the bill, there would have been less water used during this sort of hardship period that the customer is going through, and therefore the bill would be lower. Now, that the extent of how effective that is depends on the type of rate structure, right? If the utility has a really high, what we call base charge or base rate, then the customer is not going to be helped as much financially. If, on the other hand, the volumetric charge makes up more of a traditional bill at the water utility based on that rate structure, then the customer would see more of a financial benefit through these restrictors. But yeah, I believe it still reads so that they can get some sort of bill. At the least, the base charge would be billed to the customer.
Great. So we have received quite a few questions, so I'll let you wrap up your presentation, Stacy, and then we'll keep going through.
Okay, great. So the next thing we'll talk about here are just some practical tips, a few really small tips on lowering operating costs. And because, you know, of the just so many different areas that we could talk about, I decided to limit this section of the tips to vehicles, right? So in light of the pandemic and the fact that we want to physically distance our employees and our operators, one of the things that we've heard is some local government departments, you know, obviously some parts of the government are shut down or folks are working from home. And it means that there are some vehicles, so different departments within the city or the county, for instance, may have vehicles that their employees are not using as much right now in the pandemic. So we've heard of at least one water utility where they are borrowing vehicles from the fleets of different departments and using those so that they can maintain at the water utility one operator per car. And so instead of having to go out and buy more cars or even rent, that's one way that utility has been able to, one, take care of their employees, their water operators, and at the same time not incur too many additional costs, and take advantage of the fact that some of the other vehicles within the local government are not being used very much right now. So let's play with the raise your hand thing again, make sure everybody is still awake and engaged. So if your utility is doing something like this in terms of borrowing vehicles to keep your operators in separate cars, would you please raise your hand here? And then Savannah will tell us what that's looking like.
We have around 10 to 15 folks right now that have indicated.
Okay, excellent. So the idea there is to see, what other folks are doing, but also hopefully we planted a seed here. Like I said, we've heard of one utility through IB Environmental's work that's doing something like this. And then we have several others on this webinar that have played around with something like this, some sort of arrangement like this. So maybe that's something that you could consider at your water utility. If your utility is doing something like this, thanks for sharing that you were by raising your hand. And I guess Savannah is going to unraise all hands at this point. So a reminder to use the Q&A box to go ahead and put in any other sort of vehicle-related good practices that your utility has been using and you want to share with others, or if you've heard about one that you think has potential. If you could put those into the question and answer box, we again will share those with the rest of the folks on here. All right, so sticking with our theme of vehicles, another tip was that some smaller utilities, like the target audience here today, are letting operators take utility vehicles home. And so there may be, written policies at the utility that need to be adjusted, and you may have to get the board involved, maybe via a virtual board meeting, etc. In some cases, a virtual board meeting in the past hasn't been kosher, and so there are lots of changes, of course, in this situation that we live in right now. But some small utilities that we have worked with are actually letting the water operators, for instance, take the cars home. And this is an interesting practice for, I think, more than one reason, right? So the water operator can then start his or her day from his or her house, and it's kind of more efficient in some ways to leave from your home and go directly to the site that you have to work in for that day, or at least your first task or assignment. But also, in order to do this, the water operators are not coming into the office, waiting for their tasks, then going out to their sites. And this is an interesting concept that, talking to some folks who work on making operational efficiency changes at especially water utilities, they have found that even before COVID-19, this was one of their best practices recommendation. So, there's a lot of social time involved if all the water operators go in and they have to go into a certain person and talk about their tasks for the day and where they should go on their first route. And then, they can chat with each other as well, sort of a cooler talk kind of concept. But even before COVID, assigning them the day before where they were going. And so even if they came into the office, they didn't have to wait around for that task, has shown that it creates quite a bit of efficiency in terms of how water utilities are managed. So if that's something that your system is doing, maybe it's something that you can consider keeping in play even after the day that this pandemic is not with us anymore. So again, to sort of counteract what maybe all utilities, I think it's safe to say, are facing with this, lower payments, less income or less revenue. We're talking here mainly today so far about residential customers, but of course, you guys know better than I do that a lot of utilities have lost some of their commercial customers in terms of restaurants, etc., temporarily or maybe unfortunately permanently, as well as industrial customers have been affected by the pandemic. So in order to counteract some of the financial losses because of the pandemic, some of utilities are considering, no or fewer overtime hours. And so that's kind of related to the vehicle thing because, if an operator is going straight from her house to the site, then it kind of shortens the workday in some ways and hopefully helps with overtime hours, which can be expensive for the utility. So just a couple what we consider pretty practical tips on just the one issue of managing vehicles during the pandemic and keeping your water operators safe. These were some suggestions here. So with that, on that note, I'm going to go back to the outline here, and we did want to leave enough time for question and answer and sort of sharing from the folks on the phone. So to revisit the outline, we tried to address some of the non-payment issues that all utilities are experiencing right now, specifically through shutoffs and shutoff policies. Sometimes you have control, sometimes you don't, in terms of statewide moratorium. And then we looked at customer assistance programs. Now, this might be the time if you've not had a customer assistance program in the past, you may want to look into developing one, and we showed a couple tools that can help you with that initial decision-making, eligibility criteria, etc. And then we talked a little bit about this restricted flow concept in terms of lowering customers' bills during the pandemic. And then we shared a few practical tips on lowering operating costs, specifically having to do with vehicles. So at this point, this is how you can contact us at IB Environmental. And I see one of the questions was about the low flow restrictors in Phoenix. This URL you see here does contain a blog post about the Phoenix restrictor plate, or the concept of restricting water flow in general. And we'll probably be putting out a couple more that are specific, give more details on some of the existing programs. We do have right now a post from my colleague, Alana Kinnebrew, who traveled to South Africa and kind of witnessed firsthand some of the water conservation issues there. So that's one place you can get more information, especially about that particular concept. And so that's one question, Savannah, that we've sort of addressed there already. But yeah, I think this would be a good time to move into the sort of formal question and answer period, Savannah. And just a reminder, while she's getting ready to read some of those questions, is to share some of your tips and from your experience in the Q&A box as well. Savannah?
Thanks, Stacy. So we have had quite a few folks submit their comments and suggestions, so we'll definitely be able to compile that into a summary document, and we can work offline for that. But we also have received quite a few questions. So in the case that we cannot answer them live today, we will be able to follow up with you folks online via email. So to jump right in, first question, do water utilities have any data to show that the loss of the power to shut off has increased the rate of non-payments over, what would have just been the COVID impacts on payment rates?
Okay, that one was kind of long. I think it's a really good question though. Let's see. So it's asking if the water utilities have a way to prove or show that the increase in non-payment is, yep. Can you fill me in there, Savannah?
Yeah, of course. So do water utilities have any data to show that the loss of power due to shutoffs has increased the rate of non-payments over this time span of COVID?
The loss of power part is a little bit confusing, but maybe that was a typo.
We'll clarify that. So
okay, well, let me try to address what I think the question is asking. So it's probably asking if we're seeing an increase in non-payments just sort of out of genuine effects from COVID, millions of people having lost their jobs, for instance, versus some folks trying to game the system. And maybe I totally still have my job, but I realize, hey, my water utility isn't shutting anybody off, so I'm not going to pay. I don't think most utilities, especially smaller and medium-sized utilities, would have that sort of data at their fingertips to be able to answer a question like that, would be my guess. But if you are utility kind of trying to tease through that situation, looking at the job loss rate for your community or the unemployment level in your community, it should jive, right, with the number of folks or the increase in percentage of folks who are not paying. And if you see a big discrepancy there, then maybe that's going to warrant some further investigation and looking into. So that's what I will say on that one, Savannah. But we can look at it more and see if there was a typo and see if we can clarify or add more information there.
Great. All right, so to move on, can you discuss more of the options for CAPS programs, the types, other eligibility criteria, and potential methods for funding these programs?
Sure. Let me start with some of the funding. So in some states, it is pretty controversial as to whether or how you fund CAP programs, right? So the biggest, sort of most developed, if you will say, mature way that any water utility funds its projects and its programs is through its rate revenue. And in some states, it's a little bit, it's very ambiguous, and in most states actually, as to whether the rate revenue can be used to fund a customer assistance program. So that's a big area where, there are several really important publications. If you're wondering what type of state you're in, there is a great document that you can find online called Navigating Legal Pathways to Customer Assistance Programs, or to rate-funded customer assistance programs, sorry. So funding, and that one, what we consider to be a significant sort of dependable, reliable source of funding, may not be an option in some states, or generally need to be clarified by the states as to whether you can access that pot of money or not. That aside, let's assume you cannot use rate revenue. There are some nice discrete pots of funds that could be used. So if you lease space on your water towers to cell phone companies, for instance, then that's usually, it's not attributed to any one specific group of customers or one customer, for instance, industrial versus residential, or one community within your jurisdiction. So that's a pot of money we've seen utilities use to fund CAPS. Service line programs, service line insurance programs is another one that's growing in popularity. But besides the funding, which of course is very important, right? If you can't answer how you're going to pay for it, a lot of times utilities decision-making board will not go down the route of a customer assistance program. In terms of eligibility criteria, though, we would say not to reinvent the wheel. There are programs like the one I mentioned, SNAP. There's a program called LIHEAP, which is a federal program that helps customers with their energy bills. You can look at those existing eligibility criteria from established programs and probably just borrow, and say, hey, if you qualify for LIHEAP, then you qualify for Social Security maybe, then you will automatically qualify for our assistance. So that's one way. In terms of design of programs, there's a lot of options out there. A good sort of primer on what the different programs could look like is this publication from the EPA that came out in 2016 that the name contains the word compendium, so a compendium of customer assistance programs from across the country. And you can see everything from a bill discount, the discount could be on the base charge or the volumetric charge, to vouchers, that's less common, and going into people's homes sometimes to help them replace or fix faulty water equipment that is causing the customer to have abnormally high bills because they're losing water. So I think hopefully I covered that, Savannah. So they wanted to know about the design and the types and then the funding.
Definitely. So to keep moving forward, an attendee asked, could prepaid water be an option? Are you seeing any utilities that are utilizing this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So prepaid water, yes, I've worked with a couple communities or utilities that are looking at that option. I know, for example, Phoenix considered that. It does help. It's like, prepaid, other utilities that are prepaid, yes, like prepaid phone services, for instance. So it could be helpful. And again, that's an important thing to do, is look at the demographics of your community and see why people are not able to pay their water or water and sewer bills. One of the things with prepaid water is that you do have to have the money at some point to prepay, right? So it doesn't address the affordability issue holistically or totally. But yeah, it is a viable option that some utilities have played around with. And I am not familiar though with the success rate of those, unfortunately.
Thank you, Stacy. All right, so just trying to organize a few of the questions and comments that have come in. I don't mean to jump back to the CAPS program, but we did have a couple of attendees ask, do you have any suggestions about effective communication strategies to reach your customers to let them know about affordability programs?
Yeah, that's an important question. So I did hint at the fact that you may have folks who are among the neediest in your service area that do not speak, let's say, English as their primary language, right? So if you know for your community, and this is where, the local knowledge is the best knowledge, right? And most complete. If you know you have a lot of refugee resettlements in your community, and so, by golly, Spanish is not the most popular second language in your community. It's maybe, you have a lot of Burmese refugees, for instance. Then you want to include bill stuffers, or even web pages in that other sort of significant language that's spoken in your community. So that's one in terms of language barriers. The other thing with low-income affordability is that you tend to have a lot of low-income folks live in rental houses. So if they're in a rental house, sometimes some of the communication may be going to the owner or the landlord, and so that's something that you want to watch in terms of directly getting the information to the tenant who may be low income. But then there's a big overlap too between low income folks and folks who live in multifamily, and so that could be really tricky if there is a master meter at the apartment complex, for instance. And I've talked with utilities who kind of know, like, in these couple apartment complexes within my service area is where a lot of the low-income folks live, and I would like to pass on, I'd like to give the landlord, for instance, a discount, and have him or her pass that on to their tenants, that gets tricky. But there are some ways to kind of sort of hold the landlord's feet to the fire, if you will, so that he or she will pass on those discounts or savings. So yeah, that's probably where I'll leave it on that one, Savannah.
Great. So we have hit the top of the hour here. I don't want to keep folks too long. So I just want to thank you, Stacy, so much for providing your expertise for today's webinar. We did have quite a few questions and comments that we will have to follow up with offline via email, but we'll get that handled. And I will just throw it back to you, Stacy, if you have any last comments or, anything else right now.
Oh no, thank you for being such a great moderator, Savannah, and yeah, thanks to the folks here for staying awake and participating in all the polls and the hand raising. And we are looking forward to digging through your suggestions and sharing it with the other participants today.
Definitely. So thank you all again for being here this afternoon, and have a great day.